The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Prince William adjusted his formal jacket one final time. Today was different from any other royal engagement he had attended. The weight of tradition pressed heavily on his shoulders, yet something deeper stirred within him, a sense that this moment would change everything. He thought he knew about his role as a future king. Kate stood beside him, her elegant blue dress catching the early light filtering through the ancient stone archways. She had learned to read her husband's expressions over the years, and today she noticed something unusual in his demeanor. There was nervousness, yes, but also an anticipation that seemed to vibrate through his entire being. The couple had been briefed about their destination, but the details remained deliberately vague, leaving them both wondering what exactly awaited them behind the heavy oak doors they were about to enter. The royal aide who had arranged this particular visit had been unusually secretive about the specifics. All William and Kate knew was that they were visiting a special facility that had been operating quietly for decades, serving a population that rarely received public attention. The aide had mentioned that this place held significance for the royal family, though neither William nor Kate could recall any previous connections their relatives had made to this particular location. As their car wound through the countryside, William found himself thinking about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the countless engagements she had attended throughout her reign. He wondered if she had ever experienced moments like this, standing on the threshold of something unknown, feeling both duty and genuine curiosity pulling him forward. Kate reached over and gently squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of support that had become their private language over the years of public service together. The building that came into view was unlike the grand institutions they typically visited. It was modest, almost humble in its appearance, with well-maintained gardens surrounding a structure that looked more like a large family home than an official facility. The architecture suggested it had been built decades ago, its brick facade weathered by time, but clearly cared for with devotion. Small details caught Kate's attention: flower boxes in every window, a handmade sign welcoming visitors, and the sound of gentle laughter drifting from somewhere within the building. Their security detail had arrived earlier and given the all clear, but even the usually formal protection officers seemed affected by the atmosphere of this place. One of them, a veteran who had worked with the royal family for over 15 years, had mentioned to William that he had never been to a location quite like this one. The comment had intrigued the prince, adding another layer to the mystery of what lay ahead. As they approached the main entrance, an elderly woman emerged to greet them. She was not dressed in the formal attire typical of most royal receptions. Instead, she wore a simple cardigan and comfortable shoes, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her eyes, however, sparkled with a warmth and intelligence that immediately put both William and Kate at ease. She introduced herself as Margaret, explaining that she had been waiting for this day for longer than they might imagine. Margaret led them through a modest foyer, decorated with handmade artwork and photographs spanning several decades. The walls told stories of celebrations, achievements, and moments of pure joy captured in time. Kate found herself drawn to one particular photograph showing a group of people gathered around a birthday cake, their faces glowing with happiness that seemed to radiate from the image itself. There was something familiar about the scene, though she couldn't quite place why it resonated so deeply with her. The sounds from within the building grew clearer as they walked deeper into the facility. There was music, someone playing piano with enthusiasm if not perfect technique. Voices joined in song, some strong and clear, others softer, but no less heartfelt. The melody was one that both William and Kate recognized, a classic tune that had been popular for generations. But hearing it performed with such genuine emotion gave it new meaning. Margaret paused before a set of double doors, her hand resting on the handle. She turned to face the royal couple with an expression that combined reverence with barely contained excitement. She began to explain that what they were about to witness had been decades in the making, a dream that had been nurtured by countless individuals who believed in the power of bringing people together across all boundaries and differences. William felt his heartbeat quicken as Margaret's words painted a picture of dedication, love, and perseverance that transcended the usual royal engagements he was accustomed to. This was not about ribbon cuttings or ceremonial speeches. It was about real lives, real dreams, and real connections that had been fostered in this unassuming building for longer than he had been alive. Kate found herself thinking about their own children and the values she and William tried to instill in them about service, compassion, and seeing beyond surface differences to recognize the humanity in everyone they met. Something told her that whatever was about to unfold would reinforce those lessons in ways she had never imagined possible. The moment stretched as Margaret prepared to open the doors. Both William and Kate realized they were standing at the threshold of an experience that would stay with them forever. The anticipation in the air was palpable, not just from their own excitement, but from the energy emanating from beyond those doors, the sound of lives being lived with purpose, joy, and an enthusiasm for connection that promised to touch their hearts in profound ways. Margaret smiled knowingly, recognizing the mix of curiosity and nervousness in their faces. She had seen this expression before, on the faces of other visitors who had arrived expecting one thing and discovered something far more meaningful than they had ever anticipated. With a gentle nod, she began to turn the handle, ready to reveal the extraordinary world that existed just beyond the threshold. The doors opened to reveal a sight that neither William nor Kate had expected. The large, bright room was filled with people of all ages, engaged in various activities. But what struck them immediately was not what they were doing, but the atmosphere of pure contentment that permeated the space. This was a care facility for individuals with special needs, but it was unlike any institution they had ever visited. Instead of clinical sterility, there was warmth. Instead of institutional furniture, there were comfortable armchairs, colorful cushions, and personal touches that made the space feel like home. A young man with Down syndrome noticed their arrival first. His face lit up with recognition, not because he knew who they were, but because new visitors meant new friends to him. He approached with the uninhibited joy that William and Kate had only seen in very young children, extending his hand and greeting with a smile so genuine it seemed to illuminate the entire room. His name was David, Margaret explained. He had been living at the facility for 12 years. Ever since his elderly parents could no longer care for him at home, William shook David's hand. And something unexpected happened. David didn't let go immediately. Instead, he held the prince's hand in both of his own and looked directly into his eyes with an openness and sincerity that William rarely experienced in his formal royal encounters. There was no pretense, no careful protocol, just honest human connection. David told William that he was happy to meet him and asked if he would like to see his room, which he had decorated himself with pictures of his favorite things Kate found, herself surrounded by several residents who had approached with curiosity and excitement. An elderly woman named Rose, who had cerebral palsy and used a wheelchair, had spent the morning preparing for their visit by practicing a song she wanted to perform. She had been at the facility longer than anyone else, having arrived as a young adult over 30 years ago when few places existed for people with her condition. Rose had watched the facility grow and change. She had remained its unofficial ambassador, welcoming newcomers and helping them feel at home. The piano music they had heard from outside was being played by Thomas, a man in his 40s who had autism and an extraordinary musical gift. He played entirely by ear, never having learned to read music, but his ability to reproduce any melody after hearing it just once was remarkable. Margaret explained that Thomas had arrived at the facility 5 years ago, after living with his aging mother who had cared for him his entire life. When she passed away, he had been devastated, unable to communicate his grief through words, but expressing it through music that moved everyone who heard it. As William watched Thomas play, he began to understand that this facility was not just providing care, it was providing a community where people could thrive according to their own abilities and interests. The residents were not patients waiting for treatment. They were individuals living full lives, pursuing their passions, forming friendships, and contributing to something larger than themselves. Kate was drawn to a corner of the room where several residents were working on an art project together. They were creating a large mural that depicted scenes from their lives. Some painted their childhood homes, others their favorite activities, and some created abstract representations of emotions and dreams. One woman, Sarah, who had intellectual disabilities, was carefully painting a small bird in flight. When Kate complimented her work, Sarah beamed with pride and explained that birds represented freedom to her, and that living at the facility had given her the freedom to discover talents she never knew she possessed. The most striking aspect of the scene was how naturally the residents interacted with each other. William observed two men, one with physical disabilities and another with developmental delays, working together to set up chairs for an afternoon activity. They communicated with a combination of words, gestures, and shared understanding that demonstrated a deep friendship. Built over years of mutual support and companionship, Margaret guided them to a wall covered with photographs and documents that told the history of the facility. It had been established in the 1970s by a group of parents who were frustrated by the lack of appropriate long-term care options for their adult children with disabilities. They had pooled their resources, fought bureaucratic obstacles, and worked tirelessly to create a place where their loved ones could live with dignity and purpose. Over the decades, it had evolved into something extraordinary, a true community, where residents participated in decision-making, contributed their unique skills and perspectives, and supported each other through life's challenges and celebrations. William learned that the facility operated on principles that were revolutionary for its time and remained progressive even by current standards. Residents were involved in planning their own care, choosing their daily activities, and even helping to interview potential staff members. They had a resident council that met monthly to discuss facility policies and advocate for improvements. Some residents held part-time jobs in the community, as others volunteered at local organizations. All were encouraged to pursue their interests and develop their abilities to the fullest extent possible. Kate was particularly moved by stories of residents who had exceeded all expectations placed on them when they first arrived. One man had learned to read in his 50s and now helped tutor other residents. A woman with autism had discovered a talent for organizing events and had become the facility's unofficial social coordinator. Another resident had overcome severe anxiety to become a peer counselor. Offering support to newcomers who were adjusting to life in the community, the afternoon activities were beginning. William and Kate were invited to participate. Rose had prepared her song and was ready to perform, accompanied by Thomas on piano. David wanted to show them the garden where residents grew vegetables and flowers, taking pride in contributing to the facility's meals and beautification. Sarah offered to teach Kate a painting technique she had developed, while another group invited William to join their discussion group where they talked about current events and shared their perspectives on various topics. As they moved through these activities, both William and Kate began to realize that their preconceptions about disability and institutional care were being completely transformed. These were not people defined by their limitations, but individuals with rich inner lives, unique perspectives, and valuable contributions to make to their community. The facility had created an environment where everyone's abilities were recognized and nurtured, where differences were celebrated rather than merely accommodated, and where genuine relationships flourished across all boundaries. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret led William and Kate to a quieter section of the facility where she wanted to share something particularly meaningful. They walked down a hallway lined with memory boards, collections of photographs, letters, and mementos that celebrated the lives and achievements of current and former residents. Each board told a story of growth, friendship, and personal triumph that challenged every stereotype about what life with disabilities could look like. Margaret stopped before one particular board, and her voice grew softer as she began to tell them about Elizabeth. It's a resident who had lived at the facility for 25 years before passing away peacefully the previous winter. Elizabeth had been born with severe intellectual disabilities at a time when doctors advised parents to institutionalize such children and forget about them. Her parents had refused, caring for her at home until they were too elderly to continue. When she arrived at the facility at age 30, she was withdrawn, had limited communication skills, and seemed overwhelmed by social interaction over the years. The staff and other residents had patiently worked with Elizabeth, discovering that she had an extraordinary memory for faces and an intuitive understanding of emotions. She became the facility's unofficial greeter, somehow sensing when new residents or visitors needed extra comfort and attention. Elizabeth never spoke in complete sentences, but she had a way of communicating through touch, expression, presence that made everyone feel valued and welcomed. William studied the photographs of Elizabeth, seeing the transformation from a frightened, isolated woman to someone surrounded by friends and engaged in community life. In one picture, she was helping to serve dinner at a holiday celebration, her face glowing with purpose and belonging. In another, she was dancing at a resident's birthday party, her joy evident despite her physical limitations. Margaret explained that Elizabeth's funeral had been attended by over 200 residents, staff, volunteers, and community members whose lives she had touched through her simple but profound gift for making others feel seen and loved. Kate found herself deeply moved by Elizabeth's story, but Margaret wasn't finished. She led them to another section where they met Robert, a man in his 60s who had spent 40 years at various institutions before finding his way to this facility. Robert's early life had been marked by neglect and abuse in places that viewed people with disabilities as problems to be managed, rather than individuals to be supported. When he arrived, he was angry, distrustful, and had given up hope of ever experiencing genuine human connection. The transformation had not been quick or easy. Robert had tested every boundary, challenged every kindness, and seemed determined to prove that he was unworthy of care and respect. But the staff and residents had persisted, showing him through their actions that he belonged, that his life had value, and that he deserved the same dignity and compassion as anyone else. Gradually, Robert began to open up, sharing stories of his childhood dreams and revealing talents that had been suppressed for decades. Robert approached them now with a confidence and warmth that belied his difficult past. He had become one of the facility's most effective advocates, speaking at conferences and meetings to educate others about the importance of treating people with disabilities as full human beings rather than objects of pity or charity. His transformation, from an angry and broken man to a powerful voice for change, represented everything the facility stood for: the belief that every person has inherent worth and untapped potential. William engaged Robert in conversation about his advocacy work, learning that he had testified before government committees about the need for better disability services and had helped train staff at other facilities. Robert spoke passionately about the importance of choice, dignity, and community in the lives of people with disabilities. He had lived through an era when such concepts were revolutionary. He understood better than most how far society had come and how far it still needed to go. The conversation was interrupted by commotion from the main activity room, where residents were gathering for what Margaret described as one of their most cherished traditions. Every month, the facility held a celebration of birthdays and achievements, recognizing not just another year of life, but the progress, growth, and contributions each person had made to their community. This month's celebration was particularly special because it marked the 10th anniversary of the facility's partnership with a local school, where residents served as mentors and friends to children with disabilities. Kate and William were invited to join the celebration, which began with Rose performing the song she had prepared, a heartfelt rendition of What a Wonderful World that seemed to take on new meaning in this context. Her voice was not perfect by professional standards, but it carried such emotion and sincerity that several people in the room were moved to tears. Thomas accompanied her on piano, adding subtle harmonies that enhanced the beauty of her performance. Following the music, residents took turns sharing stories about their experiences mentoring the school children. David talked about helping a young boy with autism learn to paint, describing with pride how the child had progressed from being afraid to touch the paintbrush to creating colorful masterpieces. Sarah shared how she had taught a girl with cerebral palsy to use adaptive techniques for art projects, and how their friendship had grown into something that enriched both their lives. William was struck by the reversal of traditional roles he was witnessing. These individuals, who are often viewed by society as needing constant care and support, were serving as mentors, teachers, and sources of inspiration for others. They were not just receiving help, they were giving it, and in doing so, they were proving that every person has something valuable to contribute to their community. The celebration continued with recognition of various achievements. One resident had completed a literacy program and was now reading novels for pleasure, Another had learned to use public transportation independently, expanding his world beyond the facility grounds. A woman with Down syndrome had gotten a part-time job at a local bakery and was saving money to buy a special gift for her sister's upcoming wedding. As William and Kate listened to these stories of growth and achievement, they began to understand that this facility represented something much larger than just quality care for people with disabilities. It was a model for what human community could look like when it was based on inclusion, respect, and the recognition that every person has unique gifts to offer. The residents were not living on the margins of society. They were creating their own vibrant society that challenged conventional notions of success, productivity, and worth. Margaret explained that the facility's philosophy was built on the understanding that people with disabilities are not broken individuals who need to be fixed, but whole human beings who deserve the same opportunities for friendship, purpose, and self-determination as anyone else. This philosophy had guided every decision about programs, policies, and daily operations, creating an environment where residents could flourish according to their own definitions of a meaningful life. As the celebration wound down, Margaret approached William and Kate with a gentle smile that hinted at something more she wanted to share. She asked if they would like to see the facility's memory room, a special space that had been created to honor the history and ongoing legacy of everyone who had called this place home. The room was located in the oldest part of the building, down a corridor lined with handmade quilts created by residents over the years, each square telling a small story about their maker's life and dreams. The memory room was unlike anything William and Kate had ever seen. The walls were covered with thousands of photographs spanning 5 decades, chronicling not just the facility's history, but the rich, full lives of the people who had lived there. There were pictures of weddings several residents had married over the years, finding love and companionship within their community. There were graduation photos from various programs, birthday celebrations that had become legendary for their creativity and joy, and holiday gatherings that rivaled any family reunion for warmth and laughter. Margaret drew their attention to a section dedicated to residents who had become parents. This surprised both William and Kate, as they had never considered that people with disabilities might have children of their own. Margaret explained that over the years, several residents had married and had families, with the facility providing support to help them succeed as parents. She showed them photos of children visiting their parents, participating in facility events, and growing up with an extended family of caring adults who celebrated their achievements and supported them through challenges. One photograph particularly caught Kate's attention. It showed a young woman with Down syndrome holding a baby, her face radiant with maternal love and pride. Margaret explained that this was Anna, who had lived at the facility for 15 years and had married another resident 5 years earlier. When Anna became pregnant, many people questioned whether she could handle parenthood, but with support from the facility staff and her husband, she had proven to be a devoted and capable mother. Her daughter, now 4 years old, visited regularly and had grown up understanding that families come in all different forms. William found himself studying a timeline that chronicled the facility's evolution from a simple residential home to a thriving community center that served not just its residents but the broader neighborhood. Over the years, the facility had opened its doors to local groups, hosting everything from community meetings to art classes to support groups for families dealing with disability. The residents had become active participants in local festivals, volunteer activities, and civic organizations, breaking down barriers and changing perceptions wherever they went. The timeline revealed challenges as well as triumphs. There had been years when funding was scarce, and the facility's future was uncertain. There had been staff shortages, equipment failures, and bureaucratic obstacles that threatened to undermine their mission. But through it all, the residents and staff had persevered, finding creative solutions and drawing strength from their shared commitment to maintaining a place where everyone could belong. Margaret led them to a display case containing awards and recognition the facility had received over the years. There were commendations from disability rights organizations, awards for innovation in care, and letters of appreciation from families whose loved ones had thrived in this environment. But the display also included less formal recognition. U-cards from children who had visited, artwork created by community members who had been inspired by their interactions with residents, and newspaper clippings about residents' achievements and contributions to society. One particular letter caught William's attention. It was from a former staff member who had worked at the facility early in her career and credited the experience with changing her entire perspective on human potential and the meaning of a life well lived. She wrote about residents who had taught her more about courage, resilience, and joy than any textbook ever could. She described how working at the facility had inspired her to pursue advanced education in disability advocacy and had led to a career dedicated to improving services and opportunities for people with disabilities across the country. Kate was drawn to a collection of poems and stories written by residents over the years. The writings revealed inner lives of surprising depth and complexity. One poem written by a man with autism explored themes of loneliness and connection with a sophistication that challenged any assumptions about intellectual limitations. Another story, crafted by a woman with cerebral palsy, told about her dreams of travel and adventure, dreams that the facility had helped her partially fulfill through carefully planned excursions to nearby cities and natural areas. Margaret explained that the facility had always encouraged residents to express themselves through various forms of art and communication. They had established partnerships with local colleges to bring in creative writing instructors, art therapists, and music teachers who worked with residents to develop their talents and find their voices. The results had been remarkable, several residents having their work displayed in galleries, published in magazines, or performed at community events. The most moving section of the memory room was dedicated to the families of residents. Just their biological families, but the chosen families they had created within the facility. There were photos of residents comforting each other during difficult times, celebrating each other's successes, and supporting each other through life's inevitable losses. These relationships had developed organically over years of shared experiences, creating bonds that were as strong and meaningful as any traditional family ties. William and Kate learned about the facility's approach to end-of-life care, emphasized dignity, comfort, and the continuation of meaningful relationships even as residents faced their final challenges. When residents became ill or began to decline, they were not shipped off to hospitals or nursing homes, but were supported to remain in their community, surrounded by the people who had become their family. The other residents often took active roles in caregiving, offering comfort and companionship in ways that professional staff, no matter how skilled and caring, could not replicate. The room also contained recordings of residents sharing their own stories in their own words. Margaret played one recording of an elderly man named Frank who had lived at the facility for over 30 years, in a voice that quavered with age but remained strong with conviction. Frank spoke about the transformation he had witnessed in society's attitudes toward people with disabilities, remembered a time when people like him were hidden away, considered embarrassments to their families, and burdens to society. He had lived to see laws passed requiring accessibility and inclusion. But more importantly, he had experienced a change in hearts and minds that recognized the humanity and dignity of every person. As they prepared to leave the memory room, Margaret shared one final story that brought the entire experience into focus. She told them about the facility's philosophy of ordinary lives in ordinary places, which meant that residents were supported to live as much like typical community members as possible. This wasn't about pretending that disabilities didn't exist or trying to make everyone normal. Instead, it was about recognizing that everyone deserves the chance to make choices about their lives, to form relationships, to contribute to their community, and to pursue their own version of happiness and fulfillment. As Margaret finished sharing the stories in the memory room, she turned to William and Kate with an expression that combined gentle anticipation with something deeper. Look that suggested she had been waiting for this moment for longer than they might imagine. She asked them to follow her to one more location before their visit concluded, explaining that there was something specific she needed to show them. Something that would help them understand why their presence here today was so meaningful to everyone at the facility. They walked through a different section of the building, past rooms where residents were engaged in various evening activities. Through open doorways, they could see people reading together, working on puzzles, watching television, and simply enjoying each other's company in the comfortable, the unhurried way that marked the rhythm of life at the facility. The sounds of normal daily life conversations, laughter, the clatter of dishes being washed created a soundtrack of domesticity that reinforced how truly homelike this place had become. Margaret led them to her office, a warm, cluttered space, filled with photographs, plants, and the accumulated memories of decades spent in service to this community. She invited them to sit while she retrieved something from a locked cabinet behind her desk. When she turned around, she was holding a worn leather photo album and several folders filled with documents that appeared to be quite old, with careful hands. Margaret opened the photo album to reveal black and white photographs dating back to the facility's earliest days. The images showed a much smaller, more institutional-looking place, with residents who appeared formal and distant in the stiff poses typical of older photography. But as she turned the pages, the photos began to show more life, more personality, more of the warmth and community that now characterized the facility. Margaret paused at one particular photograph and looked up at William and Kate, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The photo showed a young woman in her 20s, seated at a piano with her hands positioned over the keys. Despite the formal quality of the old photograph, there was something unmistakably joyful about her expression, something that spoke of music and life and dreams that refused to be diminished by circumstance. She told them that this was Eleanor, one of the facility's earliest residents and someone who had been instrumental in shaping its philosophy and approach to care. Eleanor had been born with intellectual disabilities at a time when such individuals were often hidden away from society, considered sources of shame for their families. Her own family had loved her deeply, but had been advised by doctors and social workers to place her in institutional care for her own good and for the protection of her siblings' futures. Eleanor had lived at several institutions before coming to this facility, and her experiences had been typical of the irregimented, personal, focused on managing behavior rather than nurturing growth. But she had possessed two qualities that had sustained her through those difficult years: an extraordinary musical ability and an indomitable spirit that refused to accept that her life had to be limited by other people's expectations. When Eleanor arrived at the facility in its early days, she had quickly become a catalyst for change. Her musical talents were so evident that staff members found themselves bending rules to give her access to the piano during prohibited hours. Her joy in making music was infectious, gradually drawing other residents out of their shells and creating the first stirrings of the community spirit that now defined the place. Margaret turned to another page, showing Eleanor surrounded by other residents, all of them engaged in what appeared to be a musical performance. She explained that Eleanor had convinced the staff to allow residents to put on concerts, not just for their own entertainment, but for families and community members. These performances had been revolutionary for their time, presenting people with disabilities as artists and entertainers, rather than objects of pity or charity. But there was more too. Eleanor's story, Margaret continued, her voice growing softer, as she prepared to share something that had remained largely private for decades. Eleanor had developed a special friendship with a young volunteer who had come to the facility while studying social work at a nearby university. This volunteer had been struck by Eleanor's musical gifts and had begun bringing her sheet music, recording equipment, and eventually connections to local musicians who were amazed by her abilities. The volunteer's family had initially been skeptical of the time and attention their daughter was devoting to someone at a disability facility. But over time, they had been won over by Eleanor's personality, talent, and the obvious positive impact the friendship was having on their daughter's personal and professional development. The relationship had evolved into something resembling an adoption, with Eleanor becoming an unofficial member of the volunteers' family, joining them for holidays, celebrations, and everyday gatherings. Margaret opened one of the folders and pulled out several letters written in careful, deliberate handwriting. These were letters from Eleanor to various members of the volunteers' family, chronicling her daily life, her dreams, her concerns about friends at the facility, and her gratitude for being included in a wider circle of love and support. The letters revealed a complex inner life, a woman who thought deeply about relationships, community, and her place in the world. William and Kate read the letters with growing amazement. Eleanor's words were those of someone who understood nuance, emotion, and human nature with remarkable clarity. She wrote about helping newer residents adjust to life at the facility, about her worries for friends who were struggling with health issues, and about her hopes that society would someday see people like her as complete human beings, rather than tragic figures deserving only sympathy. One letter particularly stood out. In it, Eleanor had written about her dreams for the future, not just for herself, but for all people with disabilities. She had envisioned a time when they would be included in all aspects of community life, when their contributions would be valued, when they would have choices about their own lives, and when they would be seen as teachers and friends rather than eternal students or patients. Margaret's voice became even softer as she prepared to reveal the connection that made this story relevant to William and Kate's visit. She explained that the volunteer who had befriended Eleanor had eventually married and started a family of her own. Throughout her life, she had continued her advocacy for people with disabilities. Inspired by her friendship with Eleanor and shaped by the understanding that this community had given her about human worth and potential, the volunteer's daughter had followed in her mother's footsteps, becoming involved in disability advocacy and eventually taking a position that required her to work closely with various royal patronages and charitable organizations. Through this work, she had maintained connections to the facility and had often spoken about the impact Eleanor and the other residents had made on her family's understanding of service, compassion, and the true meaning of community. Margaret paused, allowing the weight of this revelation to settle. She then opened the final folder and pulled out a photograph that was clearly more recent than the others. It showed an elderly woman standing next to Eleanor's piano, which was still in use at the facility. The woman's face was lined with age, but her expression carried the same warmth and intelligence that had characterized Eleanor decades earlier. This was Eleanor in her final years. Margaret explained. She had lived at the facility for over 50 years, becoming its unofficial historian, its most beloved resident, and its most powerful advocate for treating everyone with dignity and respect. She had lived to see many of her dreams for people with disabilities come true, witnessed the transformation of institutional care into community living, and had played a role in shaping the policies and practices that now guided facilities. Across the country, Eleanor had passed away just 2 years earlier, at the age of 78. Her funeral had been attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched, including several generations of the volunteers' family who had remained connected to her throughout her life. In her final weeks, Eleanor had expressed her hope that her story would continue to inspire others to see beyond disability to the person within, and to understand that every life has value and purpose that extends far beyond what society might initially recognize. Margaret closed the photo album gently and looked directly at William and Kate, her eyes now bright with tears that she no longer tried to hide. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope that appeared to have been waiting there for some time. The envelope was addressed in the same careful handwriting they had seen in Eleanor's letters. But this one was different. It was addressed simply to the future royal visitors. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the envelope and began to read aloud the letter that Eleanor had written in her final months. A letter that had been waiting for this exact moment. Eleanor's words, preserved in her distinctive handwriting, spoke directly to William and Kate as if she had somehow known they would one day stand in this room, learning about her life and the lives of all the people who had called this place home. In the letter, Eleanor wrote about her hopes for the future of people with disabilities, also about her dreams for society as a whole. She expressed her belief that when communities learned to truly include and value people with disabilities, they became stronger, more compassionate, and more complete. She wrote about the lessons she had learned from a lifetime of being underestimated and overlooked, and how those experiences had taught her that every person has gifts to offer if given the chance to share them. Eleanor's letter continued with a message, specifically for any royal family members who might visit the facility. She wrote about her understanding of the unique platform that royalty possessed to influence public opinion and social change. She had followed the royal family's charitable work throughout her life, particularly admiring their commitment to causes that helped vulnerable populations. Eleanor expressed her hope that any royal visitors would see beyond the disability to recognize the humanity, dignity, and potential that existed within every person they met. But then Eleanor's letter took an unexpected turn. She wrote about a secret she had kept for over 60 years, something that connected her story to the royal family in a way that no one at the facility had ever known. Eleanor revealed that the volunteer who had befriended her all those decades ago was not just any social work student, but someone whose family had served the royal household for generations. This volunteer's grandmother had been a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth's mother, and her family had maintained quiet connections to the royal family throughout the years. More importantly, Eleanor wrote, this volunteer had shared stories of her friendship with Eleanor within royal circles, speaking about the remarkable woman who had changed her understanding of human potential and the true meaning of service. These stories had been passed down through generations, eventually reaching someone who had the power to arrange this very visit. Eleanor's influence had quietly made its way into the highest levels of British society, advocating for people with disabilities in ways she had never imagined possible. As Margaret finished reading the letter, both William and Kate felt the full weight of what they had experienced that day. They realized that their visit was not a random charitable engagement, but the culmination of a decades-long journey that had begun with one woman's refusal to accept society's limitations on her life and potential. Eleanor's friendship with that young volunteer had created ripples that had spread far beyond the walls of this facility, influencing policy discussions, charitable initiatives, and now bringing them face to face with a community that embodied everything they had been taught about service and compassion. William found himself thinking about his own role as a future king and the responsibilities that came with his position. Meeting Eleanor's friends and hearing her story had given him a new understanding of what it meant to serve others. These residents were not charity cases to be pitied, but teachers who had lessons to offer about resilience, community, and finding joy in life regardless of circumstances. Their lives challenged conventional definitions of success and reminded him that leadership meant recognizing and nurturing the potential in every person, regardless of their abilities or limitations. Kate was equally moved by the realization that Eleanor's legacy had somehow guided them to this place at this moment. She thought about her own children and the values she wanted to instill in them, about treating everyone with respect and recognizing that every person has something valuable to contribute. The residents she had met today were living proof that a meaningful life was not measured by traditional achievements, but by the relationships formed, the joy shared, and the positive impact made on others. Margaret explained that Eleanor had left specific instructions for this moment. She had requested that any royal visitors be invited to participate in a special ceremony that honored not just her memory, but the ongoing legacy of all the residents who had made this facility their home. The ceremony would take place in the main activity room, where Eleanor's piano still held a place of honor, and where the community gathered for their most important celebrations. As they returned to the main room, William and Kate found that all the residents had gathered along, with staff members and several family members who had been quietly invited to witness this moment. The room was arranged with Eleanor's piano at the center, surrounded by chairs in a circle that symbolized the inclusive community that had been built here over the decades. Margaret invited William and Kate to sit at the piano, where they found a piece of sheet music that Eleanor had composed herself. It was a simple melody that she had written to represent the spirit of the facility, hopeful but grounded, joyful but acknowledging the struggles that had been overcome to reach this point. Thomas, the resident who had been playing when they arrived, offered to perform Eleanor's composition, but he invited Kate to turn the pages of the music, making her a participant in the tribute rather than just an observer. As Thomas played Eleanor's melody, other residents began to join in, some humming, others singing words that Eleanor had written to accompany the music. The song was about finding home, about the family that is chosen rather than inherited, and about the strength that comes from accepting and celebrating differences rather than trying to eliminate them. William felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to the voices around him, These were not the polished performances he was accustomed to at royal events, but something far more powerful, the authentic expression of a community that had found joy and meaning despite, or perhaps because of the challenges they had faced. The imperfections in their voices only made the performance more moving, reminding him that beauty came not from flawless execution, but from genuine emotion and shared experience. When the song ended, the room fell into a comfortable silence that spoke of completion and understanding. Margaret stood and addressed William and Kate, thanking them not just for their visit, but for their willingness to see beyond their royal roles to connect with the residents as human beings. She explained that this was what Eleanor had always dreamed of, a world where people with disabilities were seen as complete individuals, worthy of friendship, respect, and inclusion in all aspects of society. David, the young man who had first greeted them, approached William and Kate with a small gift. It was a framed photograph of Eleanor at her piano, but surrounding the frame were small drawings and notes from each current resident, sharing what Eleanor had meant to them and what they hoped their new royal friends would remember about their visit. The gift was simple but profound, representing the collective voice of a community that had learned to support each other and welcome others into their circle of care. As their visit drew to a close, William and Kate realized that they had experienced something that would stay with them forever. They had come expecting to offer comfort and support to others, but instead they had received gifts that were far more valuable lessons about resilience, community, and the true meaning of a life well lived. They understood now that their role was not to be charitable patrons looking down on less fortunate others, but to be advocates and friends who could use their platform to ensure that the Eleanors of the world would continue to be valued and celebrated. The tears that had threatened throughout the day finally came as they prepared to leave. These were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for having been trusted with Eleanor's story and welcomed into this extraordinary community. They left knowing that their lives had been changed, their understanding deepened, and their commitment to service renewed in ways that would influence every future engagement and every decision they made about their roles in public life.